This lecture will introduce you to the early history of the Romans, and in particular the interactions between the Romans and other civilizations that were active in the area of the Mediterranean in the first millennium BC. Specifically, we will be looking at the Etruscans, shown on this map in the magenta area in northern Italy. Then we will turn to examining the Greeks, which are shown here in the blue areas. Although many people associate the ancient Greeks with the area of modern Greece, this map shows that they expanded into many other areas, including the coastal areas of modern Turkey, the shores of the Black Sea, and also southern Italy. Another culture that we will return to at the end of the lecture are the Phoenicians, which are shown here in red. They originated in the area of modern-day Lebanon and Syria, but also set up colonies in North Africa, Spain, Sicily, and Sardinia. As we will be discussing more in class, the Romans had mixed feelings about other cultures and about borrowing or adopting features from other civilizations, especially the Greeks. In order for us to be able to discuss this issue in more depth in class, this lecture should provide you with some important background about these cultural interactions. The organization of the lecture will be roughly chronological, starting with the first settlement at Rome, followed by early interactions with the Etruscans and the Greeks, then an overview of the role of Alexander the Great and the Hellenistic kingdoms, and then finally the expansion of the Roman Republic and the Punic Wars with Carthage. Starting with the earliest settlement at Rome, the Romans themselves claimed that Romulus founded the city in 753 BC. But in fact, archaeological remains of habitation at Rome occur even earlier, starting in the 10th century BC. This slide shows an artist's idea of what the first village at Rome may have looked like. And you can see simple houses or huts, which are based on archaeological evidence, such as the foundations for a one-room hut, which is shown on the lower right. The holes that you see would have held wooden posts to support the walls and roof. You can also see a small ceramic model of what one of these huts may have looked like. These ceramic hut models were used in burials to hold the cremated or burnt bones of a person. The Romans preserved one of these early huts, which they called the Hut of Romulus, and they used to conduct animal sacrifice there in order to honor their founder and first king. This village grew into a small town, and in the 7th century the Etruscans expanded their power to control Rome in the area directly south of it. This map shows the area of Etruscan control in Italy. If you're familiar with modern-day Italy, the main area of the Etruscan culture corresponds to the area near Florence called Tuscany. Ancient Roman historians tell us that a series of 3 Etruscan kings ruled Rome until the last one was thrown out in 509 BC, and then the Roman Republic was established. The Romans were strongly influenced by Etruscan culture, especially in religion, art, architecture, social structure, and entertainment. Much of our information about the Etruscans comes from their tombs, and this slide shows an Etruscan burial area with round-built tombs, presumably for wealthy families. If you enter the tomb chambers, some of them contain brightly colored wall paintings on the interiors, such as this example. Many of the paintings show people enjoying themselves through dancing, playing music, or dining at banquets. This painting, for example, probably shows 2 people dancing, while this painting from the same tomb shows a musician with a stringed instrument called a lyre. This example from another tomb again shows 2 musicians, one with a lyre and the other with a double pipe instrument called an aulos. Scholars also think that the Romans were very influenced by Etruscan music. The third man in the painting holds a drinking cup intended for wine. These musicians may have been entertaining these other people, shown on another wall of the tomb, who are eating and drinking at a banquet. In the 6th and 5th centuries in the Mediterranean, it became a new fashion to recline on couches when dining, as opposed to sitting upright. The Etruscans shown in this painting have adopted this new fashion, which may also indicate their elite status. You can see male and female couples reclining together and being served wine by the smaller figures who are probably servants or slaves. Ancient art in the Mediterranean often shows men with darker red skin and women with lighter skin, and this is one way that we can tell that these are male and female couples. The Greeks would have been scandalized by this picture of men and women reclining together, and they thought that the Etruscans had loose moral standards because they allowed women to dine alongside the men, which is not something that the Greeks did. The Romans, however, followed the Etruscan custom, as you can see in this later Roman painting of a dinner banquet found at Pompeii, where you can see men and women reclining together with food and drinks served on small tables in front of them. If we return to a map of Italy, we can see the Etruscans in the north of Italy, in the purple color, Rome in the area of the Latin tribes in the middle, shown in red, and the Greek colonies or Greek city-states in the south, shown in yellow. Just from this map, you can see that the Romans would have interacted with both the Greeks and the Etruscans, and there was quite a bit of trade and contacts among all these groups. We will now turn to look at Greek cultural influences on the Romans. I have listed some of the areas of influence on this slide, including architecture, art, religion, literature, and city planning, but there are many other areas in which the Greeks influenced the Romans, and I'll be giving examples of just some of these in the following slides. One area where we can see both Etruscan and Greek influence is in the architecture of Roman temples. This slide shows some well-preserved examples of Greek temples in southern Italy and Sicily. The Greeks developed distinctive types of temples that can be grouped or classified into at least 3 basic types, which are called the Greek orders. These are named the Doric order, the Ionic order, and the Corinthian. The easiest way to tell them apart is through their column capitals, the area at the top of the column. For example, Doric temples can be recognized with their plain column capitals. You can see an example of a Doric temple here with the plain column capitals. The Ionic order is recognized mainly through its Ionic capitals with its scroll-like volutes on the front. And again, you can see a temple with Ionic columns on the left of the slide. The Corinthian order is recognized through its very elaborate column capitals, which are supposed to represent the leaves of an acanthus plant. The Romans especially liked the Corinthian order and used it in many of their buildings. In fact, the Romans used all 3 types of columns in their architecture. If we look at the Colosseum in Rome, which was an ancient amphitheater, we can see that the lower row of columns are Doric, the second row are Ionic, and the third row are Corinthian. In this case, the columns are mostly decorative, and we can see the Romans taking Greek architectural elements and applying them in new ways to a very Roman type of building, the amphitheater. The Romans also incorporated aspects of Etruscan building in their temples. One example can be seen with the temple to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva at Pompeii. Although initially you will probably notice similarities to Greek architecture, such as the Corinthian columns in the front, but there are also features of Etruscan architecture. For example, it appears to have been an Etruscan practice to worship these 3 deities together as a triad, and this temple has 3 separate rooms in the back for each of the 3 deities, Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. Other Etruscan features are the staircase in the front and the practice of placing the temple on a high podium. This image of the remains of the temple with the volcano Mount Vesuvius in the background gives a better view of the high podium. Pompeii also has a temple to Apollo, which you can see in this plan and drawing. You'll notice that it also has a central staircase with the temple up on a high podium. If you know anything about Greek mythology, you may wonder why the Romans have a temple to the Greek god Apollo in their city. The Romans adopted many aspects of Greek mythology and religion through a process of religious syncretism. Syncretism is a word that refers to mixing or blending, usually of different religions. To give some examples, the Romans borrowed or adopted myths about the Greek sky god Zeus and applied them to their sky god Jupiter. A similar process happened with Juno, the wife of Jupiter, and the Greek goddess Hera, the wife of Zeus. Other Greek gods, such as Apollo, were simply added to the gods and goddesses worshipped by the Romans. Some of the other important Roman gods that we will be discussing in class are Venus, the goddess of love, corresponding to the Greek Aphrodite, and Mars, the Roman war god, who is somewhat similar to the Greek god Ares. We're going to shift our attention away from Italy over to Greece and the eastern part of the Mediterranean. This map shows a large black blob that represents the very powerful Persian Empire that emerged from Iran and eventually gained control of much of the Near East, modern-day Turkey, and Egypt. The Persians attempted to invade Greece twice, but the Greeks managed to defend themselves. Following the Persian attacks is a period of great cultural developments in Greece during the so-called Greek classical period. This is the time period that's often considered the high point of Greek culture, especially in art, and you can see examples from the Parthenon, the temple to Athena in Athens. During this period, there were two main rival powers, Athens and Sparta, and eventually they started a long period of warfare that resulted in a general weakening of Greek power. A new king in Macedonia, named King Philip, took advantage of this and conquered the main area of Greece. His son was Alexander the Great, who undertook an even more ambitious campaign of conquest. This map shows the extent of Alexander's conquest, and you can see that it roughly corresponds to the previous area of Persian rule, since Alexander was able to defeat the weakened Persian Empire. Alexander, however, died before a clear system of succession and governance could be established over this enormous territory. Various fighting took place among the military commanders who had served under Alexander, and the territory was divided into three main kingdoms: the Kingdom of Macedon, in the original Macedonian territory, the Seleucid Kingdom, in most of the Near East, and the Ptolemaic Kingdom in Egypt. You can also see that there are other smaller kingdoms, among these including the important Kingdom of Pergamon in western Turkey. There were many changes that happened during the time of these Hellenistic kingdoms. One change is that Greek culture spread even more into the Near East and Egypt. There was also a large increase in population and in city building. This map shows new cities that were founded in this period. Some of the most important cities of the Hellenistic period include Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch, and Pergamon in Turkey. There was a lot of trade and movement of people in this time and migration between different areas. Many of these cities became very cosmopolitan places, and both Pergamon and Alexandria attracted international scholars to come and study in their well-known libraries. These new cities often contained Greek-style buildings and institutions, and this is one way that Greek culture spread. This slide shows the Hellenistic city of Priene in Turkey and gives you an idea of what one of these Hellenistic cities would have looked like. It was laid out with a regular grid plan, with an agora or open market in the center. You can see Greek-style temples and a Greek theater. It also contained a bouleuterion, a meeting hall for the city council. In this area is the gymnasium, which was the center for education for the young male citizens of the city. You can see from this artist's reconstruction both the desire for an orderly and well-planned city, and also the attempts to enhance the city with impressive public buildings. This is a model for the city of Pergamon, which is not on a regular grid plan because of the steep topography there. You can see the various public buildings arrayed on terraces and get a sense of the resources that were spent on beautifying and improving the city. And this is an artist's reconstruction of what the city of Alexandria in Egypt may have looked like, again with a regular grid plan. When the Romans began to expand into the eastern Mediterranean, they were very impressed with these grand and well-planned cities, and it encouraged them to spend resources on improving cities in Italy, such as Rome and Pompeii. The initial period of Roman expansion happened during the Roman Republic. Traditionally, Roman history is divided into the periods of the Republic and the Empire. The first focus of expansion was Italy itself, And you can see in this map that by the 3rd century BC, the Romans were in control of most of Italy. There was another powerful empire in this part of the Mediterranean, known as the Carthaginian Empire, and the Romans fought a series of wars with them called the Punic Wars. If you remember the Phoenicians from the beginning of the lecture, shown on this map in red, they eventually formed an empire centered at the city of Carthage. Carthage is located in North Africa and had an important harbor. The Carthaginians were a major trading power in the Mediterranean and had territory spread out in North Africa, Spain, and some of the islands, such as Sicily and Sardinia. Ancient Roman sources tell us that the Carthaginians had a practice of child sacrifice. Considering how much the Romans seem to have hated their enemies, the Carthaginians, some scholars claim that the stories of child sacrifice are just Roman propaganda against their enemies. However, at Carthage and other Phoenician cities, archaeologists have found separate cemeteries of child burials. In this case, you can see that the cremated remains were placed into pots. There is a debate among scholars about whether these children simply died a natural death and were placed in separate cemeteries, or whether in fact they were sacrificed. As you may know, child and infant mortality was quite high in pre-modern societies, and these burials could represent natural deaths. One of the reasons the Romans felt so strongly against the Carthaginians is on account of the actions of the Carthaginian military commander named Hannibal. During the Punic Wars, he launched a surprising campaign of leading his soldiers, along with some elephants, through Spain, through the Alps, and then into Italy. In Italy, Hannibal's army met the Romans in a series of terrible defeats for the Romans, leading to many Roman deaths. This is one of the main reasons that the Romans began to consider the Carthaginians as their worst enemy. Eventually, however, through successful tactics, the Romans were able to win the Punic Wars and took over much of the territory of the Carthaginians, as you can see in this map. You can also see that by the 2nd century, the Romans are also ruling mainland Greece, following wars with the Kingdom of Macedon. They are also shown controlling the western part of Turkey, but this area was joined to them peacefully following the death of the last king of Pergamon, who gave his kingdom to the Romans. This may have been an intelligent move on his part, since it was beginning to be clear how the power in the Mediterranean was changing. After the Roman conquest of Greece, they began to bring shiploads of goods captured from Greece as well as slaves back to Italy. Among the goods that were taken to Italy were Greek statues, such as these 2 bronze statues of warriors, which were found in a shipwreck. Clearly, one of the ships heading back to Italy did not make it. Similar statues and other forms of Greek art were used to adorn Roman cities and private houses, and many copies were made of the Greek statues. And in this way, Greek-style art also very much influenced the development of Roman art. To give you just one example, on the left of this slide is a statue of the Emperor Hadrian from the 2nd century AD, next to one of the Greek bronze warriors from the shipwreck. Can you see the similarities between the Greek and the Roman statues? Especially notice how the man appears to put his weight on one leg, causing the rest of the body to twist and curve slightly and makes it seem more dynamic. This final slide summarizes the various effects of Roman expansion in the 3rd to 1st centuries BC. First, the Romans find themselves in control of a variety of different cultures, including the ones that I introduced at the beginning of the lecture, the Etruscans, the Greeks, and the Phoenicians. As these cultures are incorporated into the area of Roman control, the degree of cultural interaction and borrowing increases. During this period, there also began to be increased migration to the cities, especially in Italy, and more resources were spent on public buildings, partly as an attempt to beautify their cities and compete with the cities of the Hellenistic kingdoms that Romans were seeing in the eastern Mediterranean. With their new conquests, a large amount of wealth begins to be brought to Italy, and this in turn causes increasing distinctions and tensions between the rich and the poor. The Romans also start bringing large quantities of slaves to Italy, often people captured during Roman conquests. The increase in wealth and slaves will lead to debate and social tensions within Roman society, and we will be discussing this more in class.